So I am here with Chris Bourassa. Did I say that right?
Yep.
All right. He is the founder of Red Hook Studios. They are the developers of Darkest Dungeon, which recently had a port for the Nintendo Switch. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks very much for the invite.
What is your job on the dev team?
Well, I'm a co-founder of the company along with my business partner, Tyler Sigman. I do the art, narrative, help with the business, make sure there's coffee, kind of everything, a little bit of everything. But my focus is on creative direction and art production.
So like you did like the drawings and stuff like that, or do you approve
Yep.
the drawings?
No, I mean, we did the entire game with just me doing all the art. And then for the Crimson Court DLC, we added Trudy Castle to our team, who's a very, very talented artist who collaborated with me on that content. But there was a couple of years there where it was just this guy.
Wow. The art is really fantastic. Are you trained in do you have a degree in art or something like that? Because it's beautiful work.
Thanks, man. No, I have a degree in sociology, which I realized immediately after receiving it was basically fundamentally unemployable. So I didn't know what I wanted to do after university, and I'd always just drawn. And so I guess I'm self-taught. I did an animation program after university, but that was more focused on 3D animation, which I learned that I really didn't like. But the concept art portion before doing the modeling and the rest of it really resonated with me. So I just kind of built my career out from there.
Awesome. And I'll ping pong back and forth between you and the game itself. So let's talk a little bit about your history as a gamer. What are some of the games that inspired you to want to make your own games?
I guess it's a couple things. I grew up playing CRPGs primarily. I had a Sega Master System, but I grew up with most of my time spent on the 286 and the 486, with King's Quest and, later Eye of the Beholder and Eye of the Beholder 2 and things like that. So I always had this sort of real affinity for that style of game. But I never had the opportunity to work on one. I've been in games for about 15 years prior to starting Red Hook. And the projects I've been on have been pretty varied in terms of their platforms and their genres, but I never really felt like I was able to scratch the itch of a sort of a true, or at least inspired by a classic CRPG type game. So that was always sort of lurking in the back of my mind. And larger companies are inherently risk averse, and after experimenting with mobile games and AAA console games and single A sort of licensed product, I art directed a cartoon show for a year. Nothing just seemed to fit, and I felt like I'd tried a lot of other things, and I had a small child and another one on the way, and I thought if I was ever going to take a run at something on my own, I had to do it now before I needed I needed the bankable income. And so that's kind of what led me to break off.
So were you working with Tyler before you guys started Red Hook, or what?
We met at a studio in Vancouver called Backbone Entertainment, and he was a game designer there, and I was a studio art director, and we got along. We ended up playing poker together a lot, had a lot of kind of shared game values, I guess, and just became friends and always wanted to do something together. But it was about 10 years after we met, or maybe 7 or 8, before we actually pulled the trigger on this. And we had talked about it for about a year, each working at different jobs. But we would get together and, have a drink and talk about different game ideas. And this idea of sort of fallible, broken heroes and exploring heroism by contrast, and the price you'd have to pay if your job was to just kill things in the dark, really resonated with us. And so we chatted back and forth for about a year or so before finally, the timing lined up and we were able to pull the trigger.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I like most about Darkest Dungeon is that quote right at the very beginning where it says, "Hey, look, you're gonna fail at this game, and that's okay." And I really, really like that. It makes the game. It makes it. even though many times I'm playing the game and I'm like, okay, I can stay for one more turn and then I get wiped out. It makes it okay for me to say, you know what, I'm going to run away this time. And it's like, well, but you will suffer the stress of failure. I'm like, you know what? But the game said that was okay at the very beginning. And I really like that. And is that something, not necessarily the quote at the beginning, but is that overall feeling that failure is okay? Is that something that you guys had like in your original design document, or is that something that developed over time?
Sorry, you cut out there. The overall feeling?
Yeah, the overall feeling. Did it, that the overall feeling of failure is okay? Did that develop over time, or is that something that you and Tyler sat down with the original design document and said, this is something that we want to make sure to happen?
No, that was part and parcel of the core experience. We wanted to toy with player agency a little bit and convey this idea that as a manager, you can't always directly control the actions of the people under you. And we wanted to explore this idea of heroism by contrast, where by and large you would be suffering setbacks, and your skill as a leader was really more about how you were able to roll with punches and mitigate damage than it was about a power fantasy. And so we just developed, game systems and then messaging around that so that, nobody felt entitled to a win. Because I think that's one of the biggest differences between our game and a lot of other RPGs is that when you are an appropriate level, and all other things being equal, you should generally, the conventional wisdom is you should generally succeed the quest or the encounter or whatever it is, because you've got the. But our game was always intended to sort of explore the edge cases of what if. And, we have a lot of rooting in cosmic horror and horror movies in general. And they always start with that what if, like a highly skilled team of mountaineers climbs up a mountain and someone's leg breaks. Well, that's when the movie starts. It's not that you're owed an easy summit. It's that your mettle is really tested when things don't go according to plan, and they often do in life. And so we really felt like that was fertile ground to explore, and gamify. Obviously, we're not providing like a literal or even an exhaustive look at this topic, but just that idea that failure is part of success, and managing failure is almost more important a skill than capitalizing when the wins are good,
Right. So when something bad happens, how do you deal with it? That's one of the things. And in Darkest Dungeon, bad stuff is always happening. Like, you can't get away from it. And
yeah, you just have to embrace it, and you have to know what your own limits are. And it makes people think very differently about their units, like who's actually expendable, like how far should I push? What's the risk reward equation looking like? And so we wanted to challenge players to think about things a little bit differently in that regard.
Yeah, when I was playing the game, I felt like those little stress bars at the bottom, I felt like I had my own. And as I was playing, it just kept, like, my stress level just kept getting up and up and up. And I was like, I know that I can finish this. I'm almost at the end. And I would go one turn too far, or I would get lucky and it would happen. And there was some of those moments where you just wanted to shove your fist up in the air and be like, yes, I nailed it. I can't believe that worked. And there was a lot of moments like that in Darkest Dungeon. What's the hardest part of your job at Red Hook?
That's a really tricky question to answer off the fly. There's a lot of challenges on a small indie team. I think one of the biggest things that I faced is just the sheer volume of work versus the amount of hours available to me. Like when we were deep in production, I didn't lead a very balanced life, if you could forgive the euphemism. It was a lot of hours, a lot of hunching over and just like cranking out content. We were all really passionate about making a game, so I'm not looking for any sympathy in that regard. But that was definitely hard. It was a bit of a production marathon for sure. And it being a very personal project or something that's very close to our hearts, wanted to make sure that it's really good. So I felt a lot of pressure in terms of, delivering great work and delivering a lot of it. So that was a big challenge. I think the challenge has changed, though, as the sort of seasons, progress. Like what was a challenge when we were making the game is no longer a challenge now, because I'm not directly involved in a lot of the ports. We're striking out and doing another DLC, and then we're trying to get organized for our second game. And so the challenges there are, how do you avoid, sophomore album syndrome? How do you avoid the pitfalls of making sure that you have hard conversations about what's worth keeping and what's important to sort of jettison, and how do you make a subsequent product different enough that it's its own game, but not so different that the people who enjoy your work feel like you've done a 180. So the problems kind of change, and the big problem of the day or the week or even the year kind of shifts from time to time. But I guess it's not a definitive answer, but yeah, I'm kind of sort of in and around in that headspace, I guess.
Gotcha. One thing that I really liked about Darkest Dungeon is the narrator. Like, they really add to the atmosphere of the game. I also felt like the narrator's chatter was useful as well. It was like he'd say something to trigger my brain to say, oh, you didn't notice, but you just got a crit, or something awesome just happened, or something terrible just happened. Was that something that was in at the beginning, or did you develop the game and say, like, it's just too quiet, we need something to add to this, and do that later in development?
Yeah, Wayne June does the narration. He does an exemplary job, and I agree. It's really become part and parcel of the whole experience. We initially hadn't thought about it. We were putting together the way we sort of tried to roll out, our development was that we wanted to release a trailer and just see if people were even interested in the tone of the game we wanted to make. So this is, a number of years ago now, but we were putting together this sort of announcement trailer, partly to test the market and see if, we thought we could continue with development, and partly to test our own game vision, to ourselves. And I didn't want to do any of these flying title cards and upgrade your heroes and, build a town and that sort of like normal video game trailer stuff. I wanted something a little bit more cinematic and moody and tony. But we realized we couldn't just have music and images. So we needed some voiceover. And I reached out to Wayne because I had listened to his H.P. Lovecraft audiobook readings. And he said, yep, no problem, I'll do it. He recorded one take, and we put that in with the art and the music, and you could almost hear like an audible click in the room. I actually never forget it. We were on like the 15th floor or something in this guy's home studio. Power Up Audio does our audio mixing and mastering. We were in Jeff's home studio, and it was Tyler and Jeff and Kevin and I, and just watching it all together all at once. I just turned to Tyler and I'm like, well, now we need a fucking narrator. I guess that's like, it's just too perfect, And so from there, I actually wrote the ancestor character around the idea that, Wayne would be narrating it. So the lines are written for his cadence and his tone, and obviously borrowing, heavily from the source material, like the Edgar Allan Poe and William Hope Hodgson and H.P. Lovecraft, and that sort of like turn of the century or like 20s kind of pulp tonality and vocabulary. But he handles that stuff really, really well. And so basically we built that character around the idea that we needed a narrator. And so how do we justify that there's a narrator? Well, what if he's sort of a ghost? And, and kind of built the story outward from this need to have a narrator, because that first trailer just clicked so well.
It's funny how things kind of happen by accident, and that sounds like one of those accidental or happy accident moments where everything just comes together, and you can almost hear Hannibal from the A-Team say, "I love it when a plan comes together."
Totally, that's exactly what it was. I mean, we've been through times also where the opposite has happened, and that makes these kinds of moments all the more special.
So, what is it that you're excited or looking forward to? What's coming up down the road for Red Hook?
Well, we just got the Switch port out the door. We've squashed a couple nasty bugs with it. We have an Xbox port coming out as well, which will be really cool. And we're working on our third and final DLC, which is called Color of Madness. And that brings like some new enemies and some new mechanics in. We're going to try and share a little bit more concrete information about that, I think, next month. And planning and plotting game 2. Got a great outline. I think it's strong. along, and I'm looking forward to diving in on that.
Now, is game 2, and if you can't answer that, that's fine, but is game 2 a Darkest Dungeon sequel, or is it like something else?
Well, I mean, have you seen Breaking Bad?
Oh yeah, I loved it.
Have you seen Better Call Saul?
Absolutely. Although I'm not caught up.
That's kind of been my mantra. I wanna keep the name, and I think that the heroes and that kind of thing are really cool and important. So there's definitely some crossover, some similarities, but we also don't want to just make more of the same game. I think that was the point of the DLC, is to really grow the scope of the game after launch, and we want to try to break the mold a little bit and try some new things, but also want it to be related, I guess.
Awesome. So you did mention the ports that you've been working on. One thing that I noticed, and people had asked me on like my YouTube channel and stuff, was the controls were a little cumbersome, not in combat, but in town on the Switch. And I was wondering, did you guys ever put any thought into maybe using like the gyro that's in the right Joy-Con in order to be like a virtual mouse to alleviate that problem for you? Or is that something that just wouldn't work on that port?
I'll freely take that critique on the chin. This was for a little bit of background, like there were 3 of us at one point, and very, very small team. We grew to about 5. We didn't even know if there'd be enough sales to justify a single port, let alone 3 or 4. And so this was always designed as an early access Steam game. And as a result, throughout early access, we were adding features and options to the game, which were very, very natural to do with keyboard and mouse. And come time to port it over to PlayStation, Vita, Switch, Xbox, it definitely in town, I think, suffers from a bit of that, just lack of foresight, just because we didn't want to take for granted that we need to future-proof it, because we had no idea how this thing was going to go for us.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense.
But it's true. Yeah, it's a little clunky for sure. I think that we looked at some of the gyro stuff, but the overhead in terms of getting that up and running was a little bit prohibitive, and we felt like just combining the touch with the sort of the Vita controls would be sort of the best of what we could realistically do in the timeline that we had. Because the other thing is we can't sync like 6-8 months and delay it, and no game is relevant forever, and so we didn't want to be looking at like a 2019 Switch release kind of thing.
Right. And it's certainly not that the game is I mean, I've heard the hyperbole, people saying it's unplayable, but it's certainly not. It is definitely something you can get used to. It's just, it takes a little bit of using. Go ahead.
For sure. And the other thing is, and I've seen this critique a lot, the font size in the portable mode or on Vita is problematic for some people, and that's just objectively true as well. But we have no UI middleware. It's all placed with like XY coordinates. The font size, is as big as it can be without overlapping the menus. And again, it's just sort of inheriting problems from your past self and then trying your best to sort of mitigate them. But we're not always able to be completely or as successful as we'd like to be. But we are actually looking into some other solutions for like zooming in or font scaling or something like that. We're checking that stuff out now because we do want to have give people the best experience we can. It's just that in development sometimes you inherit problems from your past self or decisions that you made when you didn't know that something else would be a factor later. So we're sensitive to it for sure.
Oh, I totally understand. There's not a day goes by where I don't try. Like, I'm a teacher, and where I'll be like working on something, and I'll say, if I had just done this the other way 6 months ago, it would make right now so much easier. And so I totally get where you're coming from. It seems like you pull a lot of inspiration for Darkest Dungeon from a lot of different places. I know that you talked about like the gold box games on old school PCs and stuff like that. And you talked about some books, and you mentioned board games, I think, at one point. What were some of the board games that you played that made you want to because this is very much feels like almost like a cooperative board game. Almost like Mansions of Madness or something like that. Have you ever played that kind of game?
The board game thing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we pulled from books and movies and comics and everything. And the board game thing specifically, I think, comes primarily from Tyler, who is a huge fan of board games. And his whole approach to design is like paper prototyping. And he's a real like systems architecture oriented game designer. For me, I think the Black Tower and Dungeon are probably the two board games that kind of inform my thinking around Darkest Dungeon. I can't speak for him, but I do know that he has a much greater breadth of experience in board games, so he could probably rifle off like 10 or 12 that he was thinking about. Mm-hmm. But for me, it was definitely like Black Tower with that god-awful like plastic tower in the middle of the board and the brigands and all the rest of it that would come for you. And then I just always really have a soft spot for Dungeon. It's just such a simple, pure, romp for treasure. It was it just had this undeniable appeal for me.
Awesome. So the last question that I want to ask is, you talked about, you've had a couple different ports, and if you can't talk about this, that's fine. But I'm just curious, how is the Switch version doing versus the other versions that you already have put out? As far as not you don't have to give me like hard numbers or anything, but is it surprising you as how well it's doing, or is it not as good as you were thinking? I'm just curious if you can tell us that kind of information.
Well, I mean, I don't mind talking about it a little bit. I can't speak, obviously, in numbers. PlayStation had the advantage of being the first over the wall as far as our console debut. If you want to lump PlayStation, Xbox, and Switch into the same category, which I know that neither PlayStation, Xbox, or Switch would want to do. But so they had a bit of a lead as far as sales go overall. But our Switch sales have greatly exceeded our initial estimates and our expectations. It was absolutely worth it to do. And the game plays really nicely on the Switch, so that's always a pleasure to see. But the Switch did really, really well for us. So we want to that's part of the reason why we want to like take a look and see if there's anything we can do about the font stuff, and because we feel like the sales have justified it. So it was definitely very happy with the performance.
Well, with that being said, and I know that you probably can't answer this, but I'm going to ask, and if you can't answer it, just say I can't answer that right now. But when whatever comes out next, like Red Hook's next game, are you planning on having it follow the same path where it starts out on PC and then moves to consoles later, or is it something where you kind of want to have everything launch at once?
I really feel like we benefited from the Steam Early Access program, not just in terms of like early monetization, which was important for us at the time, but in terms of having the player feedback and people stress testing the systems and breaking the game, essentially. That taught us a lot about our own game. So I think that next time out, we would want to do the same thing. I can't speak to what ultimately will happen, but I would love to be able to exit early access and launch on all consoles simultaneously. But I think there is just too much value in the Steam early access model where you can patch and the game is updated instantly. There's no sort of like certification process. There's no cumbersome overhead that usually goes along with pushing patches and updates on console. So it's just a much more flexible sort of developer friendly sales environment. So I can't, at this point in time, caveat, I can't see us not doing early access, but I would love to plan ahead so that the other ports come out in a way that's like, timely and immediate, and they can enjoy the game fresh alongside the people who, even have participated in some of the early access stuff. I think that's more exciting than sort of bringing them out one after the other after the PC has had such a long lead. So I'd love to look at what we could do there. But it is like, just as a developer, Steam is just such a great environment to push patches live and make balance and tuning changes and immediately see what people think, that I think we would be remiss not to take advantage of that again.
All right. Well, there's definitely people who are going to want to hear all about the new DLC for for Darkest Dungeon and whatever the next game is that's coming down the pipe. Where is it that people are going to be able to find out that information, Chris?
I think the @Darkest Dungeon on Twitter is a great place. We cross-post all of our stuff, so if we do a blog post on our website, which is darkestdungeon.com, we will announce that blog post on Twitter and Facebook, which is just Facebook/Darkest Dungeon. That's where all our stuff happens.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on the show, man.
Thank you so much for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Have a good one.